Hi there, everyone. It seems like most folks have had a chance to grab a plate of food and drink and delicious food, I must say, donated by the Armenian community. And what was the name of the friend who donated the food?
So Armenians of Colorado is sponsoring, but the caterer is House of Bread.
House of
Right.
House of Bread. Yeah. Well, so thank you to House of Bread and to Armenian community of Colorado. Uh, Really special event, special food. I'm Aaron Schneider. I'm the director of the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies, which is a hub of regional research centers. African Center, Middle East Center, Latin America Center. We work closely with the China Center, and we're located here based here in the School of International Studies. It's a real pleasure to honor this day and to bring two really remarkable scholars to speak today. I'll say a few words about both of them, and then we'll get started. Professor Ronald Suny is the William Sewell Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago, grandson of composer and ethnomusicologist Grigor Suny. This is an interesting claim to fame. He was the first holder of the Alex Manoogian Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of Michigan, where he founded and directed the Armenian Studies program. He's received many awards, and two of them are the National Endowment for the Humanities Grant and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship. In 2005, the Middle East Studies Association awarded him and a co-organizer the Academic Freedom Prize for their work bringing Armenian and Turkish scholars together to further study the Armenian Genocide. In 2013, he was awarded the ASEES Distinguished Contributions to Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies Award and the Berlin Prize, an appointment as the Anna Marie Kellen Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. And I'll finish his impressive bio by saying that just in looking at the titles of his books, you can get a sense of the weight of the work that he does and how interesting it is. Revenge of the Past, Nationalism, Revolution, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union. Another book, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else. A History of the Armenian Genocide. And I'm not sure if it's your most recent book, but a widely awarded book, Looking Towards Ararat. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ronald Suny. I'll say a few words about Simon, but first, a round of applause because this is special to have him here with us today. I also want to have a chance to say a few words about Dr. Simon Magakian. Simon is a political scientist and scholar of the emerging field of heritage and security. He's Associate Fellow and Gulbenkian Postdoctoral Fellow with the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford. He's also a community scholar on Armenia at the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies here at Korbel School. And I'll say that I got to know Simon last year. He brought, along with some students, student activist organizers, brought to the University of Denver a presentation by Luis Moreno Ocampo, a famous Argentine jurist and advocate, and someone who had been looking at the ethnic cleansing of Armenians in Azerbaijan right now. And so this is when I met Simon, and I was so impressed by his work and his engagement with the community that I invited him to be a community fellow at ICRS, at our institute, and so he's been working with us ever since. He was the 20th Kazan visiting professor in contemporary Armenian studies at Fresno State and a visiting scholar at Tufts University. And he has a PhD in security studies from the world's first doctoral program in heritage crime. I'll say that his inaugural book introduced me to the concept of heritage crime. His book is titled "Sovereign Heritage Crime: Security, Autocracy, and the Material Past." He just got his PhD, and he's already got a book coming out with Cambridge University Press. So a really impressive record already from Simon, and a real treat to have him here with us. So a round of applause for Simon, who made today the event. I want to finish, and before handing over to Professor Ron, I just want to observe that today is, of course, the 110th anniversary of Armenian genocide, and I use that term intentionally because, as you may have seen, Trump issued a statement downgrading the Armenian genocide, not calling it as such in his statement of today. In Guatemala, a place that I do a lot of work in Central America and Latin America, in Guatemala, General Rios Montt was found guilty of genocide, but his crimes were downgraded by a corrupt court in Guatemala several years ago. In Gaza, today, as we speak, the International Court of Justice found that, as South Africa claimed, they showed incontrovertibly a pattern of conduct and related intention that justifies a plausible claim of genocidal acts. And there are people downgrading those acts of genocide. Genocide was a term granted legal authority because of and related to the Holocaust against my people, Jewish people, during the Second World War. And people have tried to downgrade that episode of genocide. So to deny a genocide, to downgrade it, is to re-victimize the people whose humanity has been stripped. And here, we are taking seriously this day. It is a somber day to be here together. But it's also a joyous day. I really am, I smile to look out at all of the folks here, some of them perhaps at DU for the first time, who are here because Simon brought them here through the Armenian community of Colorado. Because Professor Ron brought you here. And so I can see in the interactions, in the food that everyone is enjoying, and the fact that folks brought their kids. I love to see kids here. This is also a day of joy to lift up this community. And so, the last act of lifting up that I'll mention is I see my colleague Mike Garvey in the back there. We want Simon to stick around. So he's a postdoc, and he's affiliated as a fellow at my research institute, and we need money to keep him. So Armenian Community of Colorado, we're going to pass the hat. Mike is our development coordinator, and we're going to create a postdoctoral fellowship for Simon to stick around for another year here at University of Denver. So Mike is the pro. He knows how this is all done. But anyway, talk to him. Anyway, this is really a special day. Thank you so much for being here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Simon, for inviting me and being an incredible host these last couple of days. And I hope you'll continue for the next couple of days as well. So here we are. And what an extraordinary historical moment we all are living in right now. The United States is not at war. There's no revolutionary upheaval in this country yet, but there's an extraordinary unease. Even U.S. senators admit that they're afraid, and hundreds of people, as we sit here, are being deported from this country without trial or without any sense of due process. Thousands of government workers are being laid off without cause. The courts are trying to restrain the president, and the president appears prepared to resist those courts. And abroad, far from our shores, there are wars in Ukraine, where Russia launched a brutal invasion 3 years ago. Let's not mistake who started the war, and carries out terror attacks with rockets and drones against civilians. There's a civil war in Myanmar, mass killing of extraordinary brutality in Gaza, Sudan, and Congo, all of which have been considered genocidal by many observers, as Aaron mentioned. The United States is bombing Yemen, and Yemen sends its rockets against Israel, and Israel is occupying southern Lebanon and Syria and bombing Syria and Lebanon. Any day now, there might be an attack by Israel on Iran. The Turks are attacking Kurds in Syria, and the Americans, who have been protecting the Kurds, are stealthily, secretly, slowly withdrawing their troops from Syria. And there's a slow, simmering conflict, which many in this room know, but Americans don't know, between Azerbaijan and Armenia that could be renewed war at any time. So we're here tonight to mark and commemorate events that took place 110 years ago, but the events that we're witnessing today cannot help but remind us of what happened then and what has finally been recognized worldwide, if not by Trump, as the Armenian Genocide. And my purpose tonight is to connect what happened then in 1915 to what's going on now, and to see if past historical horrors can provide understanding about the horrors of our own time. That moment over a century ago was a time of international barbarism, World War I, the largest conflagration between nations up to that time. And that moment of barbarism, of mass deportations and killing, of genocide, remind us that we now live in a new age of barbarism, an age, though, of greater lethality. I hope tonight not only to describe what happened, but to do the difficult work of explanation and interpretation in order to show how what we might learn about 1915 can illuminate what we know about today and perhaps prevent these things from happening again in the future. So I'm going to start by talking about the concept and the word of genocide, and then I'm going to tell you about the Armenian Genocide. I can't relate it in full, but in general points and how I understand it to have happened, to explain it, and then to bring us up to date. Now, this word genocide is a highly controversial and yet important word, and it's become incredibly potent in our own times, in international political discourse, in the law, in scholarship, and other things, in thinking about mass violence. But some analysts contend that that word genocide, too vague, means too many different things, causes more problems than it solves. And the word has been cut loose from its original meaning to apply to all kinds of related events, mass killing of all kinds. Scholars have stretched this term to include all manner of crimes which should be placed under a larger category called crimes against humanity. They've put it under the word genocide. I'm going to propose tonight that we stick with the UN definition, that we have a narrow, tight definition of a particular kind of crime against humanity. Because once that genocide got out loose, once it became the crime of crimes, the greatest thing you could do, governments have wantonly and promiscuously used the word whenever they could against their enemies. Oh, they're the ones who are committing genocide. Even Azerbaijan has accused Armenians of genocide, and Armenians have accused Azerbaijan of genocide. It seems to be that in order to be a legitimate sovereign state today, you have to have a flag, an army, an opera house, and a genocide. In other words, this flagrant application has rendered it almost meaningless. Now, I have a colleague and a friend, a wonderful genocide scholar, editor of the Journal of Research on Genocide, named Dirk Moses. He teaches now in New York at CCNY. And he wrote a very important book, which itself is very controversial. And he criticizes the concept of genocide, not questioning that it's available and it's used, but that maybe it's become less useful because it's applied to too many different things. So I want to tell you some of Dirk's arguments and then see what we can take from that and what the Armenian Genocide can help secure and what we need to get rid of. So first of all, he claims that genocide leaves out too much. It's been lifted in professional, legal, and popular discourse to a rather elevated level. So it's now the crime of crimes. So what about other kinds of mass killing? What about aerial bombing of cities and civilians, which seems to be the killing of mass killing of choice of governments today, including, by the way, our own? What about civil wars? And what about international wars? In other words, there's a number of kinds of mass killing that genocide leaves out. So maybe this term, because we've elevated it, actually distorts our thinking about civilian, non-combatant destruction. In other words, genocide captures public attention in a way that other war crimes and crimes against humanity do not. And if it gains primacy of place, what about those other forms of mass killing? So that's one sense that Moses provides that maybe the term is not useful. Secondly, he says it's too narrow a concept. Now, I like it being narrow, but this is his idea, because it focuses on a single form of mass violence, namely violence directed against, this is from the UN definition, ethnic, religious, or racial groups. In other words, genocide are crimes based on hatred of people with specific cultural identities. And he's right about that focus of the concept. But I think instead of that narrowness being a liability, because it's so clear and narrow, it gives us a category that we can look at and try to explain. So we're going to try to explain eventually that kind of mass killing, not all the others. They're equally awful, but that kind. In other words, genocide is not the mass killing of people, it's the killing of a people. Armenians, Jews, Palestinians, Kurds, whatever. Third, Moses considers that such violence is thought of as non-political. Now, he has a kind of odd definition of that. That is, it seems to be directed against people who haven't done anything. They're innocent. They just are what they are on the basis of their religion or ethnicity or race. And they're not, this is not killing against people who have either resisted, rebelled, attempted to take down a government or whatever. So those people are disqualified from the concept of genocide. And the model here, of course, is the Holocaust, in which Jews were murdered because of who they were, not because what they had done. They were killed because of a rather bizarre, absurd ideology that imagined that one and the same times Jews were communists and plutocrats, Judo-Bolsheviks, but in both cases, at least, dominant forces that were secretly controlling the world or at least planning to take it over. Now, we understand, I'm sure most people in this room, that these are absurd, kind of delusional concepts, but they were enough to kill millions and millions of people. In the Armenian genocide, on the other hand, there were political dynamics. In the relations between Muslims and Armenians before and during the Armenian genocide, Armenians were acting politically. Up to 1908, they had revolutionary parties, the Dasnaktsutyun, the Hunchakyans, etc. And they fought against Sultan Abdul Hamid's autocracy. After 1908, those same Armenian parties laid down their arms and decided to cooperate with the Young Turks and try to create a constitutional order within the Ottoman Empire. So they were always political. They had illegal and then legal political parties, those that had been formerly revolutionary parties. And those Armenian parties, particularly the Dasnaktsutyun, the biggest party, actually worked with and collaborated with the Young Turks, even putting forth joint electoral lists right up until 1913, when they realized something's going on, this is not working for us. Now, that's something that Armenian historians either deny or don't emphasize, because it's kind of embarrassing that the leading Armenian political party was actually working with the people who a few years later were going to commit genocide of the Armenians. Scholars, and particularly Armenians, have paid insufficient attention, in other words, to the real political activities of Ottoman Armenians, who, after all, were Ottoman subjects. Instead, they've been tempted to look for a Holocaust model of the Armenians, non-political, innocents, who didn't resist. They would be like the Jews in World War II, exemplary victims, the socially constructed status by which sympathy and legitimacy are conferred upon some objects of violence, but not on others. If you resist occupation, let's say, or an autocratic government, or repression, then you're not innocent anymore. You're political, and you are left out of this concept. Now, you're not actually left out, and indeed, the Holocaust was also political, right? It wasn't in a normal sense, not in Dirk's sense. They may have been largely innocent, but there was a politics about murdering them because the Nazis had certain ideas. These are vermin, they're a disease, they have to be eliminated. Again, delusional, but effective in certain circles. So, in other words, it's the archetype, the popular vision of the Holocaust that makes us look at this idea of non-political genocide. Now, the UN definition of genocide has entrenched, indeed, a powerful notion, and that concept, it seems to me, is worth preserving. Governments use other logics in order to carry out horrible mass-killing projects and avoid the term genocide because of this idea of innocence. In other words, if they call you a terrorist, who's a terrorist? Everybody's a terrorist if it's your enemy and they're fighting to resist in some way or another. So the term is also terrorist has become totally meaningless. The Dashnags were proud terrorists. They used terror, that is a weapon of the weak against the Turkish government. That was the way the term was used then. But now it's an abstract, broad term. We fight wars against terrorism as if we can fight wars against a concept, a way of doing things. The genocide concept, Dirk thinks, should be replaced by another term, and he calls it permanent security. Governments look for permanent security. Now, if you look for permanent security, and genocides are precisely ways of trying to achieve permanent security, that means you don't only get rid of the people who you want to get rid of now, you get rid of future generations. You get rid of the women and children. 70% of the people killed in Gaza today are women and children, of the now 51,000 killed. Because there'll be revenge. They'll come back. We can't just be secure on Thursday. We have to be permanently secure forever. So here is the definition of genocide that I accept, that you can accept if you like. I think it's a reasonable one. It was a negotiated compromise solution to the concept of genocide that the UN adopted. And in Article 2 of the UN Convention of Genocide, 1948, they defined it as followed: any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And that would include killing members of the group, causing bodily harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole and in part, imposing measures to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Okay. So now we have some concepts, some theoretical operating ideas. I want to now turn to the genocide itself. And I think many of the people in this room are familiar with the details, so I'm going to give you a kind of overview and some major points. And the first point that I want to emphasize is the context. We're historians. We love context. I was a political scientist. Sometimes they forget about context, right? Okay, but we think about context, time and place. War. The genocide occurred within World War I, a destructive war in which the Turkish Empire was fighting on 9 different fronts, in which it would lose millions of people as well. They would lose about 18% of the Muslims of that empire. The Armenians would lose 90% of the Armenians of Anatolia, okay? It was a war in which the Young Turks had ambitions. They wanted to win it, of course. They wanted to defeat Russia, which was their major enemy. They wanted to expand into the Caucasus, perhaps even in pan-Turkic delusional dreams, they wanted to go as far as Central Asia. Their aims were, and they were going to use this war as an opportunity to eliminate any future threat to their empire. And that threat, in their imagination, I emphasize that, were the Armenians, a successful, upwardly mobile group who they thought lived better than the average Muslim. So there was a lot of resentment in the attitudes of the Turkish population and Turkish leaders. And by the way, that Armenian Christian group in the middle of the empire was used as an excuse over decades by European powers to say, you've got to reform, you've got to change, or we're going to do things to you. So the Armenians were, in the Turkish imaginary, a wedge that was used by Europe to limit or to even take pieces of the Ottoman Empire. The Turks had already lost most of their lands in the Balkans. The Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Albanians even, Muslims, the Greeks had all become independent. Millions of Turks had to leave the Balkans. And where would they go? Into Anatolia, into where the Armenians were, into historic Armenia. So there was a competition for land as well in that area. This was all done in the context of total war. Total war is war not fought between armies, but between armies and civilians. And this is one of the first of the major total wars, World War I. So the Turks wanted this thing called permanent security. They wanted to assure that they, who they saw as victims, it's always interesting, perpetrators often see themselves as victims. Even the Russians now, who are invading Ukraine, think they're the victims of Ukraine, the West, whatever. So perpetrators often see themselves as victims, and the Turks thought this is a moment to gamble, to save our empire and make it more secure. And the Young Turks believed, I think they believed, that the Armenians were a disloyal and a threat to their security. They were potential allies of their major enemy, the Russians, fellow Christians, and ordinary Turks and Kurds echoed the ideas of the elite. Now, you could make a totally, how would you like this, Aaron, rational choice argument that if the Armenians were really a threat and they were planning rebellions instead of cooperating with the Young Turks to gain some autonomy, some rights, free elections, etc., that they were really a threat, and a government can use power and violence against threats, rebellion, and so forth, right? That doesn't extend to the use of saying, because I have a threat from these revolutionaries here, these resistors, Hamas, whoever, I can then turn violence against a whole group. That I can use the crimes of a few or the resistance of a few against the whole group with which they identify. So what I'm arguing that, no, this is not rational. This, again, is a kind of demented, delusional idea of the Armenians. The Armenians were, in fact, Ottomans. They were subjects of this empire. They wanted to live. Most Armenians wanted to live within the empire. None of the parties, except the Hunchaks for a time, talked about an independent Armenia. Not the Dashnags. They wanted autonomy within a constitutional, law-abiding Ottoman empire. Who wants to change their country? Not so easily. And they worked loyally within the empire. Many Armenians don't know this. Tens of thousands of young Armenian men responded to the call of the Dashnag Suchun and the call of the patriarch of the Armenian church and were mobilized and fought in the Ottoman army, in the empire's army against the Russians. And you'll see what happens to them in a moment. I come now to the fall and winter of 1914, 1915, the first winter of this war. And the Turks have launched an attack on the Russians at a place called Sarıkamış. It's today a big ski resort in Turkey. But it was a rough terrain at that point. And they almost won the battle, and there are Armenians fighting on both sides. There are Armenians mobilized into the Ottoman Empire's army, and there are volunteers, a couple thousand, on the Russian side, fighting against, because they're Russian Armenians, right, from the Russian side, and they're fighting against the Turks. And you can see how the Turks would, again, imagine this as treachery, as something, as a threat to them. And the Turks lose this battle disastrously. Tens and tens of thousands of Turks are killed, and Armenian soldiers as well. And the leader of this army, who's now a failure, Enver Pasha is general, goes back to Istanbul, and he says, I lost that battle because of the treachery of the Armenians. And we now move to stage one of the genocide. The first stage, there are some massacres here and there in Persia on the Caucasian front. That's actually maybe pre-genocidal. But after the loss of the Battle of Sarıkamış, the Turks decided we must disarm the Armenians in the army, take their uniforms away, turn them into amele tabloları, into work battalions, and force them to work. And then they have them dig their own graves and they murder them. So stage one of the Armenian genocide is to remove the muscle of the Armenians. Now they won't really be able to resist. The second, right after this, they start deporting people from the cities, from Erzurum, from Kars, from others. But the real second stage is the one that we commemorate of 110 years ago today. They arrest 200 plus intellectuals, political leaders of the Armenians. The young Turks arrest them. Members of parliament, Armenians, even Gomitas, a musician. They arrest the writers, in other words, and then they send them out of Istanbul, and most of them are murdered in the depths of the Turkish Empire. What have they done now? They've removed the muscle. They've decapitated the nation. They've removed the brain. Now it'll be very difficult, if it ever was intended, for Armenians to resist. The third point I want to make about the genocide is one that I've already hinted at. Like all genocides, 1915 was a gendered genocide. In this case, most of the people killed were men. Many women and children were taken into the families of local Muslims, Kurds, Turks. We have some in this very room who spoke to me earlier about that. Tens of thousands of orphans found some refuge in the protection of foreign missionaries. In other words, hundreds of thousands of women and children were saved by Muslims or enslaved or forcibly married into, Muslims could have many wives, into those families. Which means, of course, that today in Turkey, there are literally millions of Turks and Kurds and Arabs whose ancestors were Armenian, and they know it because they're called often in their villages gavur, unbeliever, infidel. And we've met them now, and we've had a conference in Istanbul on Islamicized Armenians. So this event was occurring. Armenians were designated to be destroyed, and the other feature of the genocide, besides the mass killing, besides the gendered de-ethnization and conversion into Islam, the other is they were driven into the deserts, into Syria, and they were, again, later, many of them killed there. But there was no word for this event. The word that was applied to the Armenian genocide was the only word from the Bible to describe such a thing, and the word was Holocaust. So Armenian events, massacres, were called Holocaust. My great-grandparents were among the victims. Armenians resisted the genocide. At Van, a huge uprising. They took the city with the help of the Russian army that advanced. Eventually, they had to retreat to Yerevan. But there was no planned early revolt. There was no organized uprising. People resisted because they knew what was happening all over the country, and they were not going to let it happen to them. You may have heard the story of the 40 days of Musadagh. There was and couldn't be any coordinated Armenian insurrection led by the remnants of the Armenian political parties. In other words, the purported Armenian insurrection, which was supposedly led by these Armenians and the political parties, is a fiction. It didn't happen, though it was reported repeatedly back to Istanbul. So we see the falsification occurring, but not the events. And deniers of the genocide often mention that. In other words, this is a legitimate thing. The Armenians had to be deported. They were rebels. You see how you can use the rebellion, the resistance, to then justify what happened. I want to tell you something about what the leader of the genocide, the major organizer, Talat Pasha, leader of the genocide, said to the American ambassador at the time, Ambassador Morgenthau. He came and talked to him. They actually were kind of friends. They played cards. They went riding horses in the Belgrade forest north of Istanbul. And so Talat came to explain to the ambassador what they were doing. And he admitted that they had taken a firm decision to deal with what they considered Armenian treachery. Now, I'm going to quote Talat. You'll forgive me for being Talat for a moment here. And I want you to think about what emotions are being expressed in this statement. I've asked you to come here today so that I can explain our position on the whole Armenian subject. We base our objections to the Armenians on three distinct grounds. In the first place, they have enriched themselves at the expense of the Turks. In the second place, they are determined to domineer over us and to establish a separate state. In the third place, they have openly encouraged our enemies. They have assisted the Russians in the Caucasus, and our failure there is largely explained by their actions. We have therefore come to the irrevocable decision that we shall make them powerless before this war is ended. So he's telling you, these people enrich themselves. There's resentment there. They have betrayed us. There's an idea of treachery. There's anger at what the Armenians may have done. And there's already these people, because of their very nature, not just what they've done, but who they really are, essentially are, there's hatred. Hatred is a much more powerful emotion than anger. Anger is, if he punches me in the nose, I may get angry at him. I might sulk away. I might hit back. Anything could happen. That's anger. Anger is something you do against someone who's done something. Hatred is I feel it's who he is that's a danger to me. And what's the response? He has to be eliminated. If Israelis have begun to believe that Palestinians are monsters, that's in the language of the people in the government, that they are not human beings, that they're animals, they are essentially people you cannot negotiate with or you can't live with. They have to be eliminated. And that's the beginning of what will become genocide. I'm going to make 5 conclusions here about genocide. First of all, I'm going to tell you that I believe that the ambitions of the Young Turks, who seized power, by the way, in a coup d'etat in January 1913, was to eliminate the Armenians as a people, as a nation. This is what makes it a genocide. They did it because they wanted what Dirk calls permanent security against what I consider an imagined threat. That threat was defined in ethno-religious terms, and it was born in the eyes and minds of Ottoman leaders and their adherents. The project to eliminate them, or at least render them impotent, unable to reproduce their own community, that's genocide. Making people impotent, unable to reproduce their nation, their community, their cultural identity. The crimes were complexly political, for the goal was to target a defined group and to destroy them for the purpose of securing your empire. Point number one. Point number two, the genocide was the result of a long-term elite idea about Armenians as a threat. It translated then into popular hatreds, resentments, etc. What I call in the book an affective disposition, a worldview, emotional, cognitive, rational, irrational, of what the way Armenians were constructed. And once you do that, once you define a people like that, then you can carry out this kind of genocide, and it becomes reasonable. If Jews are really vermin, a kind of disease that are destroying the Aryan race, then it is perfectly rational to get rid of them and eliminate them physically, right? If you believe the original delusion. And that's what I'm saying the Young Turks did here. Thirdly, the destruction of the Ermeni millet, as it was called, the Armenian nation, was carried out in the three ways I described, right? Deportations, mass killing, and conversion into Islam. But I would also argue, and here it's a little controversial, this was not about religion. It wasn't Muslim against Armenian or Christian. They had lived together for 500 years. And in fact, in the Quran, you're supposed to not only tolerate, but promote and protect the peoples of the book, Jews and Christians. No, it's not about religion, but religion was the marker of who people were and who you would define as the enemy. And it's not about nationalism. The Turks were not yet nationalists, that like the Kemalists would be. They were empire preservers, and they believed there was a danger to their empire, which they were going to keep as much as they could. They weren't giving away the Arab lands, and the Armenians were in the way. And the choice of genocide, this also is controversial. I've fought other Armenians and historians about this, but it's more or less accepted now. The choice of genocide was not inevitable. It didn't have to be. It was a matter of choice. It was a matter of choice. They could have chosen to negotiate, to deal with the Armenians, to accept them as a loyal population. But no, in their delusional vision, in their imagination, they saw them as a danger. And remember, threat is often a perception. I'm not afraid of him or any of you in this room. A lion coming toward me, I might be afraid. Yeah, that'd be a real threat. But in general, it's how you create the idea of who might be a danger. So Armenians were killed, not only for whom they were, not only from what they had done, or for what some of them might do. This genocide was preemptive. It was to prevent threats in the future. It was to create permanent security. And I want to conclude now, the third part of the talk. That is, I want to talk about how what I told you today about the concept of genocide and the Armenian genocide itself tells us again about today. Remember that there are crimes against humanity, big ones like, and I would include aerial bombing, ethnic cleansing, which is what went on in Karabakh. It wasn't a genocide, it was ethnic cleansing, and other things like that. But genocide is a particular kind of crime against humanity when you target an ethnic, religious, cultural, national group. And that's the form that can be seen as a threat to security, and that is what genocide becomes. It's a kind of ethnocide. And we are able to distinguish between these different crimes. And if we limit genocide that way, we can try to explain it. Why target cultural groups? Why have you imagined the threat in this way, whether they've done something or not done something, whether they're innocent or whether they're resisting? Because genocide is a real phenomenon, and it's not to be merged with other crimes against humanity, other forms of mass killing. And it should not be placed above them. but it to be specified and explained. So why then do states or movements turn against and decide to eliminate as much as possible ethnic and religious groups? And what I've said today, I think, in a way, from the Armenian genocide, begins to give you such an explanation. You create this affective disposition. You imagine the threat in ethnic, religious, or cultural terms, and then you think that threat has to be eliminated in order to create permanent security, and you try to eliminate that group. And by the way, ultimately you fail, because there's still Armenians in this room and in Hayastan and around the world. They're still Jews. They have a state of their own today. So if we take that narrow definition of genocide, and this is my very last point, and we look at how effective dispositions, ones that prioritize the search for permanent security, occur, and that this is a choice by governments that will lead to genocide, we might then turn, in the last minutes I have, to the case that Aaron mentioned, the most glaring case of genocide of our own time, going on right now on the evening news: Gaza, Israel, and Palestine. The long-term Israeli policy, and by the way, this is dangerous to say on campuses today, right? Not me, I'm old. Are they going to go after me? Trump wants me, right? But in Ann Arbor, in my own hometown, the FBI broke down doors yesterday and raided and arrested a student and threatened others. And it's very hard to protest now on a campus. Harvard capitulated, now it's suddenly found its strength. Columbia's capitulated, now it's found its strength. So this is a controversial and difficult issue. First of all, here's a brief account. The long-term Israeli policy toward Palestinians began as violent ethnic cleansing in the Nakba of 1948, when 800,000, roughly, Palestinians were expelled and became refugees from what is now the state of Israel. So that's ethnic cleansing. Whatever the ambitions of early Zionist settlers in Palestine may have been, that was what they accomplished at that time. And among the different forms of crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing is different, though related to genocide. Ethnic cleansing, and we did this to our own native peoples in this country, ethnic cleansing involves the removal of a population from a territory by force because the perpetrators want the land, but not the people on the land. Sound familiar, Colorado? Ethnic cleansing does not necessarily involve mass killing of a people to destroy that people in whole or in part and make it impossible to reproduce its existence, its culture, its nation, its possibility of forming a state, which would be the case in genocide, but they're closely related, and death takes place in ethnic cleansings. Later, Israeli policies continued after the Nakba as settler colonialism and occupation, with the possible intention of further ethnic cleansing through forced settlement of Jews on Palestinian lands. And then something changed radically after the horrific and inexcusable Hamas massacres of October 7th, 2023. At the time, the extreme right-wing government of Netanyahu began a war against Hamas that in turn and time involved mass displacement, horrendous killing of civilians, and mass starvation. You know that no goods are let into Gaza at the moment for the last 50 days by Israel. Wanton killing of civilians, now numbering over 51,000 people, 70% of them women and children, aerial bombing of whom? Of tents, of apartment buildings, of whole neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, humanitarian institutions in Gaza, as an effort to eliminate not only Hamas, that's the official version, but in fact Palestinians, and Palestine as a possibility in the future. That's why this lecture on this day is not some academic, esoteric exercise in historical reconstruction. This lecture is particularly relevant for the whole world is watching a genocide taking place in real time. And these events having global effects on humanity and the international security system as we sit here. It's difficult, but important to recognize that the Netanyahu government, like the Young Turks 110 years ago, are carrying out a genocidal policy to prevent the reproduction of a nation. So Dirk Moses is right about the hierarchy. We want to get rid of that with genocide at the top. We want to get rid of the ideas that victims are only innocent, that this is the crime of crimes, or that the Holocaust is the necessary model. The power of the argument we're trying to make is that we want to turn our attention to other crimes that states and movements commit in their drive for permanent security. Ethnic cleansing, aerial bombing, brutal attacks in the name of a war on terrorism, on insurrections, resistance to occupation, etc. Genocide is a real phenomenon, not to be merged into other crimes against humanity, and not to be placed above them, but to be specified and explained. And why this happens, it seems to me the Armenian genocide, I would submit, may begin to move us toward such an explanation. And if we better understand why genocide, we will be in a better position to say, for real, never again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Suny, for the fantastic presentation. Thank you, Professor Schneider, for the kind introduction. And thank all of you, especially ICRS and Armenians of Colorado, under the leadership of Buzan Yeremian, for making this important gathering possible and the visit of Professor Suny to Colorado possible, which will include joining the Armenians of Colorado commemoration at the First Baptist Church and the state capitol on Sunday at 1 p.m., headlined by the professor and by the mayor of Denver. Today, April 24th, marks the commencement of the greatest atrocity of the Great War, marked, as we now know, by President Trump's unrecognition of the Armenian genocide. As the world falls apart around us, remembering the Ottoman Turkish crime of the Armenian genocide, whose victims included not only Armenians, but also Assyrians and Greeks, and arguably Kurdish and Turkish individuals who risked their lives to save fellow humans, this genocide is critical for understanding, as Professor Suny mentioned, the ongoing era of mass atrocity. Here is one example of how critical. After the end of World War I, the scale and impunity of the Armenian genocide upset the man we heard about, Raphael Lemkin, so much that he dropped philosophy for legal scholarship to ultimately coin the word and help codify the international law of genocide. He correctly predicted that the unpunished Armenian genocide would unleash more crimes. Unfortunately, Lemkin was right, losing the great majority of his family in the Holocaust. This legal legacy is monumental. But as Professor Suny brilliantly discussed, Dirk Moses' illuminating theoretical framework of permanent security challenges our thinking of genocide, and most importantly, our excusing of supposedly lesser mass atrocities. My response to this discussion is a question that at first may seem to have an obvious answer. Permanent security for whom? To answer this question, we should first ask whether permanent security is truly security. It is an important question because all ongoing atrocities of our times are perpetrated in the name of security, with collective punishments aggressively justified as fighting evil. To explore this beyond the obvious security logic, I'd like to offer a case study of indirect human suffering that is at once easier to follow because the victims are not humans, but also harder to comprehend because sacred spaces can hardly pose a real security threat. And this is the subject of my 20-year forensic research, the destruction of Armenian heritage by Turkey's ethno-linguistic ally Azerbaijan between the years 1997 and 2006 in the region called Nakhichevan. It was the destruction of the entire heritage following the first post-Soviet Armenian-Azerbaijani ethno-territorial war over the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh, known to Armenians as Artsakh. The causes and consequences of this enduring enmity are common across conflicts, from mutual bloodletting to incompatible narratives of historical rights and wrongs. The worst manifestation, as the professor mentioned, happened a year and a half ago, when after blockading and starving the disputed region for 9 months, Azerbaijan violently captured it and forced its complete depopulation, an ethnic cleansing for some, a genocide for others, that is well explained, it seems, through permanent security. No people, no conflict. Yet Azerbaijan's ongoing hostilities against Armenia, despite having achieved more than it could have imagined just years ago, challenge the notion of security. Why continue a hostility after victory? This is why the earlier destruction of cultural monuments, in my view, gives deeper insights to the question of permanent security for whom? The cultural destruction took place in a region that was not a war zone, not even a disputed terrain. Yet it targeted and it eradicated every single stone and structure that Azerbaijan perceived to be Armenian, namely an estimated 89 medieval churches, 5,800 intricate cross-stones, and over 22,000 historical tombstones. A destruction so deliberate and so total that when confronted with one of my investigative pieces exposing the erasure, Azerbaijan's government that said that the missing monuments were not destroyed because they never existed to begin with. A shallow survey of this total erasure could be a misreading of security and revenge. One, we can say, yes, it is an imagined security for a future in the form of silencing, disquieting material memories, or what I call, paraphrasing George Orwell, past-proofing the future. And second, we could think of it as revenge following Azerbaijan's defeat in the First Karabakh War. But a closer look into this cultural destruction shows how unpopular it was among the populace, dispelling issues of security and vengeance. Here's a very brief historical survey. The long Armenian presence in the region of Nakhichevan gradually ended during the communist era under Soviet Azerbaijani control. As Professor Suny and others have argued, this was actually one of the triggers of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. While Armenians were now gone from that region, Nakhichevan in the late 1980s, the monuments, churches, and cemeteries were largely intact until 1997 for two particular reasons. One, for decades, Azerbaijan had told the local Muslim population that the monuments were not Armenian, so there was nothing to worry about them. Second, even more importantly, even if the locals considered churches and cemeteries as political threats, the fear of haunting, that is, that if you destroy a church, your family will be punished forever, had created a coexistence of sorts. So the state-sponsored cultural destruction that Azerbaijan initiated was not a permanent security for the people. On the contrary, as Akram Aylisli, the erstwhile national writer of Azerbaijan, writes about his hometown in Nakhichevan, describing the post-massacre, quote, "In every family that sees an Armenian home, there are ill people. Did you ever once see peace in any of those homes? Not one person in Aylis who at the time tried to improve his own life through violence against the Armenians knows peace to this day. The ghosts of those we have tormented won't give us peace." Professor Suny said that permanent security ultimately fails. And in the mind of Akram Aylisli and Azerbaijanis like him, the destruction in Nakhichevan was what we might call permanent insecurity, that you will be haunted forever. Of course, Azerbaijan's autocracy would disagree. In its imagination, Armenian culture was an existential threat, a threat, the most important part, that the Aliyev regime and only the Aliyev regime could resolve. The cultural destruction was therefore not a security measure, but rather a, what I call regime security, perpetrated not to help the people, but prolong the Aliyev regime. in conclusion, the Armenian genocide, I would say, is not too different. Sure, Turkey rid itself of nearly all indigenous Christians that could have one day created a separate state. But instead, after the Armenian genocide, Turkey found Kurds as the new securitized community, a community that perhaps Christians could have been a counterweight when it came to national aspirations. Today, the provinces where the Armenian genocide took place are mostly the most underpopulated and underdeveloped in Turkey. And perhaps the most important lesson, it's often forgotten that the Armenian genocide was perpetrated by legitimacy-seeking authoritarian pashas that had just committed a coup d'etat, that overthrown the government, and the three that came to power, Talat, Enver, and Cemal, were looking for legitimacy. The professor mentioned the Battle of Sarıgamış that Enver lost and blamed on Armenians. You know why he lost? The professor gave a key. It's a ski resort. It was a very cold winter, and they were underdressed. Most Ottoman soldiers, including Armenian Ottoman soldiers, died before the battle started from freezing. And so it had to be blamed on Armenians. Could it be that the Armenian genocide was what scholars have called performance legitimacy for Talat and company? Otherwise, if the Armenian genocide were such a self-evident permanent security campaign, why would so many individual Turks risk their own lives to save Armenians like they did with my own paternal great-grandparents? I think both Lemkin's concept of genocide and Dirk Moses's concept of permanent security, as Professor Suny brilliantly showed, are equally key to the discussion of state-perpetrated mass atrocity. But we should not underestimate the pursuit of power. We must ask, for whom a permanent security was really sought? After all, so many political crimes of the past and of today, including the mass killing of children justified in the name of security, are committed by those seeking legitimacy and longevity, whether for staying in power or out of prison. The lessons of the Armenian genocide, therefore, should include the very relevant and urgent danger of authoritarianism everywhere, including in this country. Thank you.
Thanks to both of these fantastic presenters and fantastic presentations. I'm left with a number of thoughts. I'm going to offer one and hope that you all will respond and offer your own observations based on where I'm coming from, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience. I really think that this is a celebration for this community, and I think there's a lot of folks here who want to welcome you and carry on this conversation. Both of you have spent time thinking deeply and explaining the concept of genocide, why states pursue genocidal acts. I'm left with a curiosity based on Simon's observation that it never works. There can be no permanent security. Its pursuit is as much an indicator of insecurity, of the lack of confidence of a regime. Confident regimes do not have to eliminate a population or a people. So when thinking about this observation, I guess I go back to something that, as I began our conversation today. Why do states downgrade genocide? Why do they deny genocide? Why is that something that they think makes them safer?
You want to answer?
And please carry on this conversation as in the directions that you find most interesting.
So I took notes at what Simon said, which I really liked. I thought it was great. And so many ideas that I'm going to steal. I mean, I will try to use and footnote in the future. Permanent security for whom, right? Remember, we think of people in power, governments, elected officials in this country, or autocrats like Putin or whatever. But there's more than that. And you don't have to be a Marxist to believe this. It's good if you are, but if you aren't, it's okay. Nobody's perfect. But it's a whole system that's being preserved. It's a whole hierarchy of people. So some people are kept in positions. They work in the system that has to be preserved. They're the ones with property, privilege, and so forth. So it's not only their agents, that is, the people who are elected or in government, but also the whole hierarchy. And I've developed that idea in studying the Tsarist Empire, where the Tsar freed the serfs, but made sure that the nobles got everything they needed. And he was protecting the nobles against what might have been a serf revolt, right? So I love the idea that there's no such thing as permanent security. Unfortunately, I start to think, well, wait a minute, okay, Israel has been insecure since it was founded, and it's going to continue to be insecure as long as there are Palestinians and Arabs, etc. They've been at permanent war for 70 years, and it's going to continue. That's permanent insecurity. Russia, too. Russia, it lost the war that it wanted to win in Ukraine, decapitate Zelensky, take all of Ukraine, make it a puppet state, and so forth. And now they're settling for land, 18% of Ukraine, right? Why? Because Russia's not big enough, right? They need more land. They can't even govern what they have. They need 18% of Ukraine that's been totally destroyed. It's completely lunatic. But then most wars are lunatic. Okay, so, and they're going to be a pariah state, and that's permanent insecurity. But what about the American Indians? What about genocides that worked? What about Australia? What about this country of ours, right? We got rid of what they considered. I'm writing a book on nationalism, and the chapter Inventing America is about, what's it about? They get rid of the people because they want the land and not the people. So we got all this good free land. And then we needed people to work it. Oh, I got an idea. Let's bring black people from Africa. So we'll get free labor, free land, and the biggest capitalist country in the world developed, right? And of course, it's not free labor, free land, slavery, getting rid of Indians. It's entrepreneurship of white North Americans that really did it, North Europeans. Okay, that's my view of American history. But it worked. So you did get permanent security by getting rid of the local populations. And you can think of other countries where this worked as well. Why deny genocide? One last thing. People ask all the time. In fact, when I gave this lecture on genocide in Turkey, when it was still illegal to do so in 1997, I think it was extraordinary. I was asked that question, right? And basically, Turks have like a lot of nations, including Americans, including Russians, these big, powerful nations also suffer from what I'd call fragile identities. They're not quite sure who they are. They want to believe we're just good, benign people. Okay, so we killed more people outside of America than any other country in the world since 1945. Okay, but we're still good people. Vietnam, Iraq, and all that, but we're still good people. So we have a kind of fragile identity, and we don't want to have it threatened. And Turks are people like that. They believe that what they did during World War I and after was what they call Kurtuluş Savaşı, the war of liberation. How can you taint the founding myth of the Turkish Republic by saying, no, babam, you actually murdered hundreds of thousands or millions of people, right? And you should, in fact, acknowledge that. So denial is important in order to shore up your very fragile identity.
I think there's been a lot of discussions about denial and what it entails. I'm still thinking about that question, and I don't know if I have a good answer. But it's important to realize, because a lot of Turkish individuals, might deny the Armenian genocide by questioning the use of the word genocide. But the denial of the Armenian genocide started much earlier. In fact, it started while it was happening, even before the term genocide happened. And I think there is a performance legitimacy studies of Chinese authoritarianism. There is some sort of a performative power to showing that you can get rid of people and get rid of accountability. So it's just like, mafias when they give medals for protecting women and so forth. I think there's some of that in there, but I'm still thinking about the question. And I'm sure the audience has been waiting to ask questions. So
I think there's some microphones around, and if not, then we'll pass this one. Oh, okay. Mandy has one. If people want to raise their hand, I see one in the back and one here. And go ahead and raise your hand as the ideas come to you.
This work? I'd like to just start off by thanking all three of you for an insightful conversation today. My question is for Dr. Suny. I agree with everything you said, but to nitpick, there is one point of contention that I wanted to ask you about. I think the analogies you drew between the Armenian genocide and Azerbaijan's aggression against Armenians and Israel's military campaign in Gaza are valid in a lot of ways. However, the one thing I wanted to ask was how you think a specific factors into account, which is that Hamas in Gaza, in that scenario, Hamas, which is an internationally recognized terrorist organization, and I think this is basically accepted as objective truth at this point, does and has been intentionally using their people and civilians in Gaza as human shields. And before you answer, I know that you did mention that, some victims of genocide do resist genocide, and that doesn't make it any less of a genocide necessarily. But I think that this is a unique situation in which it's not the victims who are resisting, but it's their leadership that is subjecting them to further violence in a way. And so I was just curious as to how you think that factors into the equation.
So this is a really horrible war. I would say, first of all, I think Hamas has been defeated militarily, and that bombing from the air particularly is unnecessary. It's such a small area. I don't know how you could not use, as you put it, human shields. Yet as people are living together. Now, you know what atrocities more recently have been committed, including the killing of those ambulances and then deliberately burying them underground to cover them up, right? And somehow it was discovered, a cell phone of a man who was dying saying Allah Akbar. I mean, horrible events, right? So this is beyond Hamas, beyond defeating Hamas. And that's why I think if you want, genocide is about intent. And eventually there'll be a smoking gun 100 years from now when the archives open up. It's starting to come, but it's hard to find that. We've never found a smoking gun in the Holocaust. But you can, by the results and the kind of warfare that is carried out, the deliberate killing of civilians over and over and over again, 51,000, and we don't know who's buried under the rubble. Just look at the scene. Just look at the pictures. Then you can't say this is about destroying Hamas anymore. This is about destroying Palestine. And by the way, it's going on simultaneously in the West Bank, where they're bulldozing settlements and villages and refugee centers. So I think it's incontestable what's happening. Now, we would like, if it were at all possible, for this thing to end and to have a ceasefire. Israel doesn't want a ceasefire because the right-wing government doesn't want it, and Netanyahu will probably go to jail. So you're caught in a bizarre, people have to die in Gaza 20 a day, 50 a day, or whatever, because of this conundrum of how are you going to solve that problem. Hamas is ready for a ceasefire, but it wants to somehow survive, right? If they actually stopped and had a ceasefire and had elections, then Hamas would lose, I think, actually, the election. That people are discontent, there's already opposition to Hamas, etc. And remember, Hamas did win an election once. You remember? There was an election that George W. Bush wanted to have in Palestine, and Hamas won in Gaza. And what did they do? Both the Americans and the Israelis said, they're terrorists. We can't negotiate, and they wiped them, they pushed them aside. In other words, they wouldn't deal with a government that had just been elected. You know, and therefore, what does that government do? It does what it's most used to doing. And by the way, it's Hamas who undercut Arafat. I won't go through this whole history. They then turn to terror, to violence, to blowing up buses, etc. I have no love for Hamas, you know, but there's a history there. And Netanyahu, in fact, thought he could negotiate and live with them. He turned out to be wrong. Things build up, rage occurs, and we had October 7th.
Thank you.
Professor Suny, your lecture was great as usual. I wonder, when you were talking about the motivations for the genocide, how greed falls into your equation. According to the Kurdish author Umet Kirk, he states that once the villages were depopulated, then their lands, their homes, their businesses, and their wealth were a free-for-all for the remaining Turkish population. Could you please address that?
So you are asking a question I'm often asked, is why did ordinary people engage? Notice I talk mostly about the elites, the people who carry it out, and then others followed. And that's hard because of the lack of sources, right? But we have sources. A lot of the ideas that that dominant groups have then filter down to ordinary people, right? Nobody thought when Trump came down that escalator, golden escalator, that the things he said about Mexicans being rapists, you know, and some of them are good, was even acceptable. And now it's the norm to think about immigrants as eating cats and dogs. I think that occurred here in Colorado, in fact. Yeah? No? Well, wherever. Yeah. So anyway, you can see how elite opinion is important. So the regime itself promised refugees, mujahir, to come and take the land. And Armenians were thrown out with promises that they could come back, and land and property, businesses were all given to Turks and to other Muslims. This is interesting. There's a concept in Marx called the primitive accumulation of capital, right? Somehow you got to get capital and give it to people, right? And that occurred in England by getting rid of the peasantry and giving it to the lords. Well, in America, the primitive accumulation of capital was get rid of the Indians and take the land. And in Turkey, the primitive accumulation of capital was kill everybody and take everything. It's the most primitive accumulation of capital. So there's greed, obviously. There's taking the land. The Turks developed a middle class, an entrepreneurial class, a bourgeoisie, by taking over the factories of Greeks, Armenians, and others who were thrown out. That's how they developed into a modern capitalist country.
Oh, it takes a second. Okay, great. Thank you very much. The smoking gun of the Holocaust is Mein Kampf in the Wannsee Conference. The smoking gun of the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian genocide was the Pasha's agreement to Turkify Turkey, because they knew they were not going to be successful in the war, and they were going to try to consolidate. But most importantly, when will your paper be available?
Whenever you ask for it, and send me an email.
Okay, great, because I need it.
I have a question. So in Turkey today, 110 years after the Armenian genocide, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's still illegal to call it a genocide, right? And presidents, in the U.S., Trump, obviously today, but even in the past, other presidents would not call the Armenian genocide a genocide. Yet, in parallel, in Germany, it's the opposite is true. If you deny the Holocaust, that's illegal. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so I'm wondering, what's the difference in the situation there? Why is it that one people have to live 110 years later in complete struggling to get recognition for their ancestors' suffering, while another people somehow they're perpetrating the home nation, has done the opposite and has capitulated and is, decades later in remorse for it. What's the difference?
I'll try to answer it first. It's a great question, and I know there's a lot of that can be said about the question, but there's actually part of history that's very much forgotten, and that's what Vagan Dadrian called judgment at Istanbul. There was a time after the Armenian genocide, some might argue while it was happening in some other ways, in 1918, 1919, when under British pressure, Turkish courts convicted Ottoman officials, including Enver, including Cemal, including Talat, of crimes against Armenians. And they were sentenced to death. They had escaped by that point with help from the British. And so they were never imprisoned. And if they had not been executed, Atatürk would most likely have released them by then. So there was a point when Turkey was forced to do what Germany was forced to do during World War II. But then Atatürk had his revolution, and the professor referenced that, and history changed. Literally, history changed in Turkish textbooks, not only about Armenians, but everything. Everything for a brief period of time in Turkish history was presented as being original Turkish, etc. So I think that's an important part of history to remember. Under British pressure, the Ottomans convicted the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. At the time, the word genocide did not exist, and there are actually some hangings of some of the perpetrators, but not all. And I think that was interrupted by Atatürk. But Professor Suny, if you want to add more.
So, first of all, there's a saying in my paper, which I didn't read, that the Ottomans lost the war, but the Turks won the war, right? So the Ottoman government falls in 1918. By 1923, they formed the Turkish Republic. And the Turkish Republic signs the Lausanne Agreement, and there's no mention of the Armenians already, and they're already denying. And Simon said correctly that, in fact, they'd been denying it while it was actually going on. Much of the language that you found then goes into the denialist campaign. So they build a republic on basically rejecting the past of the Ottoman Empire and saying this never occurred, right? The Germans lost the war, Second World War. They were occupied after the Second World War. They became a democratic Western-style capitalist state, an Eastern German state. And both Germanys, East Germany and West Germany, recognized immediately the crime of the Holocaust. And they began to cleanse themselves of Nazis to some extent. There's a whole important history there. And Germany itself, the now German Republic, unified Germany, is kind of embarrassed by those events, has very good relations with Israel, and may feel, I don't know if nations and states can feel emotions, maybe they can, but feels a kind of guilt and shame about what occurred. So they in some sense, they not only recognize the genocide, they take an effort to promote, history, knowledge of the genocide. There are memorials all over. It's taught in the schools, etc. And so they actually repress, and my friends tell me this, they repress criticism of Israel. So they won't talk about Gaza, right? And that's happening elsewhere, as you know, as well.
So my question was, given the circumstances that occurred in Germany, would it be at all possible for a similar sort of justice or peace to occur between Armenia and Turkey, and what circumstances would entail that, if it's even possible this late into the future?
I'm always optimistic, but this is not an age of optimism right now. And the trend, around 2000, 2002, when Erdogan first came to power. We thought he was a Democrat or more democratic. He fought the Kemalists. He fought the army. He built new constitution all the way up to around 2011. And then it got worse and worse. And clearly he was moving toward more and more autocratic government. It still has elections, and he lost significantly in certain ways the last election, etc. But it's not going to happen. There was a moment of opening toward the Kurds, toward the Armenians. We even had one of our Watts conferences, our workshop conferences in Istanbul in 2015. But those days are over. So it's moving in the wrong direction. That doesn't mean that without a change of government, Erdogan dies or whatever, things may move in a different direction. Because Turkey is a very highly developed state in which people are highly educated, and in which people, a lot of people, though the kids and people who are not informed, still believe that there's no genocide. But educated society knows, and there are fantastic Turkish scholars who are doing great work on Ottoman history that in fact recognizes the genocide, the Hamidian massacres, etc. So there are significant developments. In other words, in civil society, among the intelligentsia, there is this movement. So what has Erdogan done? He's cracked down on the universities. Can you imagine tracking down on universities? Trying to get universities to conform to the views of a government, right? And not allowing free speech on campuses? That's what's going on in Turkey. My son-in-law, who's Kurdish, just got his citizenship, thank God, no longer green card, now is an American citizen, is a Kurd from Eastern Turkey, right? And he said to me, welcome to my country.
If there are any others, grab us out.
Should I go next? Okay. Some years ago, before the alleged coup, I was in conversation with members of the Gulenist party or movement, not only here but also in Turkey, and I was a guest of the Gulenists in Turkey. And when I spoke to younger members of the movement, they exhibited that ignorance that you talked about, where they were taught in schools that the Armenians had committed atrocities and murdered Turkish villagers and so on. And of course, I knew that they were talking about what I would refer to as the Vartanats, the Vartanatsagan, who were the righteous resistors that you referenced. But when I spoke to older and quite frankly wealthier members of the movement, they tended to blame the secular government. And they said true Muslims didn't do this sort of thing. They felt that this was not a religious conflict, that it was the secular nationalists. And I think I heard you say that it wasn't really that, but that's how these Gulenists were processing what happened. And they were more willing to embrace the Armenian genocide. It's the factual nature of the Armenian genocide, by blaming a government that they themselves didn't care for and were in opposition to. So I'd love to hear you talk about that. And would you throw in some commentary, because I didn't hear you mention it, either one of you, the concept of the loyal millet. The Armenians were the loyal millet, the loyal community, non-Muslim community, that were apparently revered, at least so I was brought up to believe, until, and this is from my family, secular nationalists who were quote unquote poisoned by European concepts of nationalism, both Armenian and Turkish, upset the whole apple cart and ruined the Ottoman Empire and its liberality. That's how I grew up. That's what my family believed, and they were pan-Ottomanists. My family were royalists, essentially, who believed in the emperor and the Ottoman Empire. You referenced that there were Armenians who did so, and I'm the descendant of some of them. Can you throw in some commentary about that?
Yeah, that's a book's worth of answers, and I'd be happy to try to give it to you, but I can't. So first of all, the Turkish nationalists were what I'd call empire modernizers. They were doctors, they were engineers, they were soldiers. They wanted to make a modern state. And they were originally constitutionalists. And they were what we call Ottomanists. They were going to include all the nationalities. Once they got to power, they realized how difficult that was, and that there was a big question about what about the land that was being taken away from Armenians by Kurds and by others out in Anatolia. They couldn't solve that problem, and they swung quickly over toward more Turkish nationalism and eventually to let's get rid of these Armenians, right? So they were allies with the Armenians, and then they moved. They were some secular. Talat was very devout Muslim, though. And what they aimed for was an empire that was more Muslim and, if possible, more Turkish. And there was now a growing Turkish identity. The word Turk in 1900 meant a bumpkin, a countryman, someone who was uneducated and provincial. And later it was adopted by the nationalists as a sign of what you wanted to be, a sign of pride. What you wanted to be was Ottoman, Osmanlı, and that was considered pride. And the second question was about, Yeah, that's a complicated thing. The Gulenists themselves are a very complicated group. I don't think we want to get into the details on that. There was a last question that you asked that I forgot. So I'm old, I forget things.
All right. Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. Great lecture and the opportunity to listen. My question is, we stopped at the Armenian genocide, and in my opinion, arguably another great calamity happened in the region 2 years later is the Great October Revolution. What do you perceive the outcome, because genocide lasted for years, what do you think the outcome of the region or Armenian highlands or Anatolia and the Republic of Armenia would be if the revolution didn't take place?
You're hitting me where I live, right? So I've made a career at trying to explain the Soviet Union and Soviet Armenia against the Cold War, against anti-communism, against anti-Sovietism, against anti-Russianism, etc. Armenia was saved by the Bolsheviks. For better or for worse, it was saved by the Bolsheviks. A little republic was formed, and Armenia became more Armenian, bigger, more powerful, etc. But it was within the Soviet Union. So it was limited. And eventually they would suffer Stalinism, the terror, the collectivization, etc., the crushing of nationalism, and so forth. And then Stalin died, and they began to revive again as a modern state, always within the limits of the Soviet Union. So whether it would have been different, because the free Armenia, that was ruled by the Dashnags up to 1920 was very weak. It had no friends in the neighborhood. The Americans were far away. They wouldn't take a mandate. So the best bet for them was the Soviet Union. And yet, if you're part of an empire, you pay the price of that empire. The good that it did, they built us Yerevan, they built us a subway. We lived in peace, there were no wars, but you also suffered from all the limitations of that empire.
Thank you for the great presentation. I actually have questions for Dr. Suny. I actually have 3 questions, if it's okay. Given your extensive work on how historical memory is shaped and politicized, how do you interpret the Armenian government's occasional hesitancy or even obstruction in advancing international recognition of the Armenian genocide? What factors, in your opinion, political, geopolitical, or internal, do you believe contribute to this ambivalence, and how might this affect the global disclosure on genocide prevention?
So are you talking about the current Armenian government?
Correct. Sure, yeah.
I thought that was 3 questions.
Thank you. You've written about the importance of naming and recognizing genocides as act of historical justice. In light of that, how do you see the international communities and perhaps Armenia as a state response to the events unfolding in Gaza today? Can the lessons from the denial and delayed recognition of the Armenian genocide be meaningfully applied to contemporary atrocities, including those that are politically inconvenient to acknowledge? And my last one is, in light of Turkey's joining South Africa's case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, do you believe Armenia, were it politically willing, could benefit from supporting or joining such a case, both in terms of moral consistency and strengthening its own historical claims around genocide recognition? I ask this hypothetically, of course, as Armenia appears to be moving in completely opposite direction, even considering withdrawal of its own case against Azerbaijan.
You may
Thank
know
you.
more about this than I do, but Armenia has been critical of Israel's policies in Gaza. And so I saluted that. On the other hand, Israel has not recognized the Armenian genocide and is an ally of Azerbaijan. And Israeli drones were, along with Turkish Bayraktar drones, are what defeated the Armenians in the war. The first drone war was the Armenian-Azerbaijani war of 2020. So that's important to remember. The second, if you invite me again sometime and I haven't died yet, then I will come back and talk to you about Artsakh. But you won't like what I have to say, right? I'm going to briefly tell you this. I'm going to lose all my Armenian friends now. Armenians won the First Karabakh War, and they took roughly 20% of Azerbaijan. And they thought, we can be Israel. We can occupy this land, we can settle it, and we can keep it. And we couldn't. And we lost opportunities to negotiate. It wasn't easy to compromise. And eventually, the Azerbaijanis were much richer, have oil, have friends all over the place. They destroyed Karabakh, took it, and Armenia lost. And so I would say Armenians, like Russians today, like Americans all the time, are guilty of what I would call imperial overreach. They try to use their power much more than they're able to do it. And you will be defeated if you tried that. So I don't want to blame Armenians. It's sad that we lost it. It's a tragedy that Artsakh is gone. But if you look at the situation objectively, which is hard, I'm Armenian. I love being Armenian. I was born an American. I'm American. I'm a patriotic American. But I don't root for the home team. I never root for the home team, neither Armenian nor American. I'm a scholar. I'm supposed to look at things critically and objectively, and I try. And it's not easy because I have passions. I want America to be a better country than it is. I worry about it. And I want Armenia to be safe and to prosper. I love Armenia. But we're in a very bad situation at the moment. Armenian government does recognize the genocide, of course, but it doesn't promote it as part of its foreign policy because it wants ultimately to make it some kind of opening toward Turkey so that the border can open, trade can take place, which will help Armenians. And Armenians really want that, as do Turks in Kars and on the other side of the border. Thank you for your attention, and it was great.
I agree. So thank you so much to my guests. Thanks to all of you for participating. There's a good amount of food left over, so please eat, and especially my graduate students, fill your pockets, go home, eat well. But thank you all for being here.